My name is Vincent Kowalski, and I'm an HVAC technician who survived the first 6 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. 6 months ago, I was fixing air conditioners in Detroit's summer heat. Now I'm the only thing keeping 300 people alive in negative 30-degree weather after Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun. My fiancée Lisa is trapped somewhere in frozen California, but I can't leave because if these heating systems fail, everyone here dies. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Right now I'm sitting in what used to be the Ford Rouge plant in Detroit, and it's negative 30 degrees outside. The snow is piled 8 feet high against the windows, and I can hear the wind howling through the gaps in this old industrial building. There are 300 people sleeping in makeshift beds around me, and the only thing keeping them alive is the heating system I've been nursing along for the past month. My hands are cracked and bleeding from the cold. My back aches from crawling through frozen ductwork, and I haven't had a hot shower in 4 months. But every single person in this building is breathing because of the work I do every day. 6 months ago, I was Vincent Kowalski, just another HVAC technician in Detroit who spent his days fixing air conditioners and complaining about overtime. I had a comfortable apartment, a reliable truck, and a fiancée named Lisa who was planning our wedding for next spring. I worried about normal things like mortgage payments and whether the Lions would make the playoffs. The biggest crisis in my life was when a hospital's cooling system went down, and I had to work through the night to keep the patients comfortable. That was before Yellowstone exploded and changed everything forever. It was Tuesday morning, July 9th, 2024, and I remember it like it happened 5 minutes ago. I was crammed into the ceiling space above the intensive care unit at Detroit General Hospital, sweating through my work shirt as I wrestled with a busted compressor. The temperature outside was already pushing 85 degrees at 10 in the morning, and the nurses kept joking about how they needed me to hurry up before their patients melted. The head nurse, Patricia, brought me a cup of ice water and said the ICU felt like a sauna. I told her I'd have the system running in another hour, maybe 2 if the replacement parts gave me trouble. I'd been working at Detroit General for 3 years by then, and they always called me when their critical systems failed. There's something about hospital work that gets into your blood. When you know that people's lives depend on the equipment you maintain, you don't cut corners. You don't take shortcuts. You do the job right, even if it takes all night, because failure isn't an option. The staff trusted me, and I took that responsibility seriously. I was the guy they called when their life support systems needed emergency repairs, when the operating room ventilation went down, when the pharmacy's temperature-controlled storage started failing. Around 10:30 that morning, my radio crackled to life. It was Carol, my dispatcher back at the shop, and she sounded confused. "Vinny, you seeing anything weird on the news? They're saying Yellowstone just exploded or something." I dropped down from the ceiling and wiped the sweat off my forehead. "What do you mean exploded? Like a bomb?" "No, like the whole park. It's some kind of volcanic thing. Turn on a TV if you can find one." I walked down to the waiting room where they had a big flat screen mounted on the wall. There were maybe 20 people scattered around in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, some waiting for news about family members, others just trying to stay cool. When I asked someone to change the channel to the news, everyone looked up with interest. The footage was like something out of a disaster movie. This massive column of ash was shooting straight up into the sky, higher than any building I'd ever seen, spreading out at the top like a giant umbrella. The camera was shaking, and you could hear people screaming in the background. The news anchor was talking fast, stumbling over words like supervolcanic eruption and unprecedented geological event. They kept showing the same clip over and over, this gray-black cloud billowing up from what used to be Yellowstone National Park. An elderly man in the waiting room shook his head and said it looked like the end of the world. His daughter told him not to be dramatic, that it was probably just a big forest fire or something. but I could see the worry in her eyes. The news anchors kept using words like catastrophic and civilization-changing event, and they brought in experts who talked about volcanic winters and nuclear winter scenarios. One geologist said this was the kind of eruption that happened once every 600,000 years, the kind that could affect global climate patterns for decades. I remember thinking it was interesting, maybe even exciting in that weird way that disasters are exciting when they're happening to someone else. Wyoming was 1,000 miles away. Detroit had its own problems to worry about. I had air conditioners to fix and a hospital full of patients who needed me to keep them cool. But over the next 3 days, everything changed. The ash cloud spread faster than anyone predicted. By Wednesday evening, the sky over Detroit started looking hazy, like there was a thin layer of smoke hanging in the air. By Thursday, the sun looked dim and orange, like it was setting even though it was noon. By Friday, the whole Midwest was covered in this gray twilight that never seemed to lift. The temperature dropped 10 degrees that first week, and people were actually relieved. After months of heat waves and record-breaking temperatures, a little cooling off felt like a blessing. I was still busy with air conditioning calls that first week, but I started noticing changes. The emergency rooms were getting busier, more car accidents as visibility got worse, more respiratory problems as the air quality declined. The hospital administrators were asking questions about our ventilation systems, wondering if we needed to upgrade the filtration to handle the ash that was starting to settle on everything. Lisa called me Thursday night from her sister's place in San Jose. She said the sky looked weird there too, and the news was showing footage of ash falling in Colorado and Nebraska. She sounded worried, asking if I thought she should fly home early. Her return flight wasn't scheduled until the following Tuesday, but the airlines were already talking about possible delays due to visibility issues. I told her not to worry, that it would probably blow over in a few days. Volcanic eruptions happen all the time, and life goes on. But something in her voice made me uneasy. She said the experts on the West Coast news were talking about this being different, bigger than anything in recorded history. She said her sister's neighbor worked for the National Weather Service, and he was telling people to stock up on food and water, just in case. Just in case what? I asked her. I don't know, she said. He wouldn't say exactly. But Vincent, what if this is really bad? What if it doesn't just blow over? I laughed and told her she was watching too much news. California always overreacted to everything. A little ash in the sky wasn't going to shut down the world. I had a job to do, patients depending on me, and bills to pay. We'd been through ice storms and power outages before. Detroit knew how to handle emergencies. But by the second week, even I couldn't ignore what was happening. The temperature kept dropping, 20 degrees below normal for July, then 30 degrees. The ash was falling like snow now, coating cars and buildings in this fine gray powder that got into everything. You couldn't go outside without covering your mouth and nose, and even then you'd come back inside coughing. The air conditioning calls stopped coming in, and suddenly everyone wanted heating. That's when I realized my entire world was about to flip upside down. See, I'd spent 15 years learning how to keep buildings cool. I understood refrigeration cycles, heat pumps, ductwork design, everything you need to know to move hot air out and cold air in. But now, for the first time in my career, people needed the opposite. They needed me to figure out how to keep buildings warm when the outside temperature was dropping toward freezing in the middle of July. The hospitals were the first to call. Detroit General's administrator, a sharp woman named Margaret Torres, pulled me aside after I finished converting one of their rooftop units from cooling to heating mode. She said they were getting reports from other cities, other hospitals, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't a temporary situation. The government was calling it a climate emergency, and medical facilities needed to prepare for extended cold weather operations. Vincent, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. If this cold weather continues for months, can our heating systems handle it? Can you keep this hospital warm enough to save lives?" I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about the equipment I'd been working on, the age of the building, the capacity of the boilers in the basement. "Margaret, our systems were designed for Michigan winters, not for Arctic conditions in July. If it gets much colder, or if this lasts much longer, we're going to have problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where people die." She nodded grimly and said the board was authorizing whatever overtime I needed to work on solutions. They were also asking me to train some of the maintenance staff on basic heating repairs, just in case. Just in case of what, she didn't say, but we both knew what she meant. Just in case I couldn't be everywhere at once. Just in case the situation got worse. By the third week of July, it got worse. The snow started falling on a Sunday morning. Real snow, thick and heavy, not the light dusting you might see in late October. I was at home trying to repair my own furnace when I looked out the window and saw these big white flakes coming down. The temperature was 38 degrees. In Detroit. In July. My phone started ringing immediately. Detroit General, then St. Mary's Hospital, then the Veterans Administration facility on the east side. Every hospital in the city was having heating problems. Systems that hadn't been turned on in months were failing. Boilers that should have been serviced in the spring were breaking down. And the temperature was still dropping. I spent that entire week driving from hospital to hospital, emergency shelter to emergency shelter, fixing heating systems that were never meant to handle this kind of demand. The city had opened up school gymnasiums and community centers as warming stations, but most of them had minimal heating. Old buildings with outdated equipment. I was converting gymnasium air handlers, jury-rigging ductwork, teaching janitors how to operate boiler systems they'd never touched before. The emergency rooms were filling up with hypothermia cases and carbon monoxide poisoning from people trying to heat their homes with camping stoves and charcoal grills. I responded to 3 house fires in one day, all caused by people using space heaters improperly or overloading electrical circuits. The fire department was stretched thin, and the paramedics were running constant calls for people who couldn't stay warm. That's when I got the call that changed everything. It was Margaret Torres from Detroit General, and she sounded panicked. "Vincent, we need you here right now. Our main boiler just went down, and we've got patients in the ICU who can't survive if the temperature drops much more." I was across town working on the heating system at a senior center, but I dropped everything and drove through the snow to the hospital. The boiler room was in chaos. Water everywhere from a burst pipe, the main unit completely shut down, and the backup system struggling to keep up. The temperature in the ICU had already dropped to 60 degrees, and the nurses were wrapping patients in extra blankets. I spent 72 hours straight in that boiler room, working with minimal sleep and cold pizza from the cafeteria. I had to completely rebuild the main heating system, fabricating parts that weren't available anymore, rerouting pipes around the damage, and upgrading controls that hadn't been touched in 20 years. But I got it working. When the heat came back on and the ICU temperature started climbing back to normal, Margaret Torres found me in the boiler room, exhausted and covered in grease and pipe joint compound. She looked at me for a long moment and said something that still gives me chills. "Vincent, I don't think you understand what just happened here. You didn't just fix our heating system. You saved lives. Real lives. People who would have died if this building got any colder." She paused and looked around the boiler room, at all the pipes and valves and gauges that kept the hospital running. "And I think you're going to have to do it again. And again. Because this isn't over. This is just the beginning." She was right, of course. But at the time, I still thought we were dealing with a temporary emergency. Bad weather that would pass. A crisis we could handle with hard work and determination. The government kept saying it was under control, that they were working on solutions, that normal weather patterns would return. I managed to get a call through to Lisa that night. The phone lines were getting unreliable, but we connected for about 10 minutes. She said California was getting snow too, even in the valleys where it never snowed. Her sister was talking about driving south to Arizona or New Mexico, somewhere warmer. The airports were shutting down because of ash and ice on the runways. "Vincent, I'm scared," she said. "What if I can't get home? What if this doesn't end?" I tried to reassure her, told her I'd figure out a way to get to her if the airline stayed grounded. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't realistic. I was working 18-hour days just keeping the hospitals in Detroit running. People were depending on me. I couldn't abandon them to drive halfway across the country on roads that were becoming impassable. "Just stay safe," I told her. "Stay warm. I'll find a way to get to you as soon as I can." Those were the last words I ever said to her. By August, the communication lines were failing regularly. Power outages were becoming more common as the electrical grid struggled with unprecedented heating demands. The snow was piling up faster than the city could clear it, and the temperature was still dropping. Negative temperatures in Michigan in August. It was insane, impossible, but it was happening. And I was becoming the most important person nobody had ever heard of. Every hospital, every shelter, every emergency facility in the city had my phone number. When heating systems failed, they called me. When people were freezing, they called me. When the difference between life and death came down to whether a boiler would start or a furnace would keep running, they called me. I realized that my 15 years of experience fixing air conditioners had accidentally prepared me for something nobody saw coming. I understood heat transfer, ductwork, combustion systems, electrical controls. I could diagnose problems, fabricate solutions, and train others to maintain equipment. In a world where staying warm meant staying alive, I had become indispensable. But I also realized something else, something that kept me awake at night even when I was exhausted from 20-hour workdays. The equipment I was fixing wasn't designed for this. The buildings weren't insulated for Arctic conditions. The fuel supplies weren't planned for continuous heating through what should have been summer weather. We were fighting a losing battle against physics and time, and every day it got a little bit harder. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with a regular emergency anymore. And I was about to become the most important person nobody had ever heard of. August brought changes that made July look like a minor inconvenience. The snow that had started falling in the final week of July never stopped. It kept coming down, day after day, accumulating faster than the city could handle. The snowplows were working around the clock, but they were fighting a losing battle. Streets that got cleared in the morning were impassable by evening. The salt trucks ran out of supplies, and the city started rationing what little they could get from other states. But it wasn't just the snow that was killing us. It was the cold. By the first week of August, we were seeing temperatures that Michigan normally didn't hit until January. 20 degrees below zero, then 30 below. The kind of cold that kills car batteries, bursts water pipes, and turns human breath into ice crystals that fall to the ground. My job had completely transformed. Instead of fixing air conditioners, I was now the guy everyone called when their heating systems failed. And they were failing constantly. Equipment that was designed to run occasionally during Michigan winters was now operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Boilers were overheating from constant use. Heat pumps were freezing up. Furnaces were burning out from running non-stop. The hospitals were my first priority, and Detroit General had essentially put me on permanent staff. Margaret Torres gave me my own office and a master key that opened every door in the building. She said I needed to treat the hospital like my personal responsibility, because in many ways it was. If the heating failed in the ICU, people died. If the pharmacy got too cold, medications would freeze and become useless. If the operating rooms couldn't maintain proper temperature, they couldn't perform surgeries. I was working 18-hour days, moving from crisis to crisis. One morning I'd be rebuilding a boiler at Detroit General, and by afternoon I'd be across town at St. Mary's Hospital, trying to jury-rig a heating system that was never designed for Arctic conditions. The emergency shelters were even worse. Most of them were in old buildings with minimal heating capacity, school gymnasiums with ancient furnaces, community centers with space heaters that kept tripping circuit breakers. The city had opened up warming stations in every neighborhood, but keeping them operational was becoming impossible. I remember one night getting called to an elementary school that was being used as a shelter for about 200 people. The furnace had died, and the backup heaters couldn't handle the load. By the time I got there, the temperature inside was dropping toward freezing, and people were huddled together under blankets, sharing body heat. I spent 8 hours in that school basement, working by flashlight because the power kept going out, rebuilding a furnace that should have been replaced 10 years ago. I had to cannibalize parts from the school's other heating units, and even then I could only get it running at about 60% capacity. But it was enough. When the heat came back on, people actually cheered. That's when I realized that my role had evolved beyond just fixing equipment. I was keeping people alive. Every repair job, every jury-rigged solution, every system I got running meant the difference between life and death for real human beings. The pressure was overwhelming, but it also gave me a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. The supply chain problems were getting worse every day. The parts I needed for repairs were becoming impossible to find. Automotive stores, hardware stores, even industrial suppliers were running out of inventory. The roads were too dangerous for most deliveries, and the few trucks that were still running were prioritizing food and medical supplies. I started hoarding anything that might be useful: pipe fittings, electrical components, insulation, anything I could use to keep heating systems operational. My van became a mobile workshop and parts warehouse. I had tools and supplies crammed into every available space: spare heat exchangers, backup thermostats, rolls of ductwork insulation, boxes of pipe fittings. I was carrying enough equipment to rebuild most heating systems from scratch, because that's exactly what I was having to do more and more often. The communication problems were getting worse too. Phone lines were failing as cell towers lost power, and landlines got damaged by the weight of ice and snow. My dispatcher Carol was still trying to coordinate repair calls, but half the time I couldn't reach the office. I started carrying a battery-powered radio so I could monitor emergency frequencies and respond directly to crisis calls. It was during one of those radio-monitored calls that I first heard government officials using phrases that should have scared me more than they did at the time. Long-term solutions, sustainable heating strategies, winter preparedness protocols. They were talking about this situation lasting months, not weeks. They were planning for a winter that might not end. The hospitals were starting to ask me questions that made it clear they were thinking the same way. Margaret Torres pulled me aside after I finished upgrading their backup boiler system and asked me to estimate how long their current fuel supplies would last if they had to run heating systems at maximum capacity through what should have been summer and fall. When I ran the calculations, the answer was sobering. Maybe 3 months if they were lucky and rationed carefully. "What happens after that?" she asked. I looked at her and realized she was asking me to plan for something I'd never imagined having to plan for. "Margaret, if this cold continues through the winter, we're going to need to make some hard decisions about which parts of the hospital we can afford to heat, about how to prioritize limited fuel supplies, about what happens when the equipment starts failing faster than we can repair it." She nodded grimly and said the hospital board was already discussing contingency plans. They were identifying the most critical areas that absolutely had to stay warm, and they were looking at ways to consolidate patients into smaller spaces if necessary. They were also asking me to train more of their maintenance staff on basic heating repairs, because they understood that I couldn't be everywhere at once. That conversation was the first time I really understood what we were facing. This wasn't a temporary emergency that would resolve itself in a few weeks. This was a fundamental change in how we had to live, and the systems we'd built our civilization on weren't designed to handle it. The emergency rooms were telling the story of what was happening to ordinary people. Hypothermia cases were coming in every day. Elderly people who couldn't afford to heat their homes. Families with children who were trying to stay warm in apartments with broken furnaces. People who had attempted to repair their own heating systems and ended up with carbon monoxide poisoning or house fires. I responded to dozens of residential calls during August, and most of them were heartbreaking. People who had lived in the same house for 30 years, watching their heating system fail and knowing they couldn't afford to replace it. Elderly couples who were sleeping in one room with space heaters, trying to concentrate their body heat in the smallest possible space. Families who were burning furniture to stay warm because they couldn't get heating oil or natural gas delivered. I did what I could, but residential heating systems weren't my priority. I had to focus on hospitals, emergency shelters, and facilities that were serving large numbers of people. Every hour I spent fixing someone's home furnace was an hour I wasn't available for a crisis that might affect hundreds of people. It was a brutal calculation, but it was the reality of resource allocation in a disaster. The personal toll was getting harder to ignore. I hadn't had a real day off since the snow started falling. I was living on coffee and whatever food I could grab between calls. My apartment had become just a place to shower and change clothes when I had time. Most nights I slept in hospital break rooms or empty offices at whatever facility I was working on. And I still hadn't been able to reach Lisa. The phone lines to California had been down for over a week. The last conversation we'd had was brief and full of static. She said her sister's family was planning to evacuate south, but the highways were becoming impassable. She said she loved me and that she'd find a way to get home when the airports reopened. I told her to stay safe and that I'd come get her as soon as I could. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't realistic. The roads between Detroit and California were closed. The airports were shut down. And even if I could figure out a way to travel, I couldn't abandon the people who were depending on me to keep them alive. Every day I delayed meant more heating systems would fail, more people would freeze, more lives would be lost. I was trapped by my own indispensability. September brought new challenges that made August look manageable. The power grid was starting to fail under the unprecedented demand for electricity. Heating systems that had been converted from gas to electric were drawing more power than the infrastructure could handle. Rolling blackouts became routine, and when the power went out, most heating systems shut down with it. I started carrying a portable generator in my van, but it was only powerful enough to run essential systems temporarily. When Detroit General lost power for 6 hours during the first week of September, I had to prioritize which parts of the hospital got emergency power. The ICU and operating rooms were non-negotiable, but everything else was optional. Patient rooms, administrative offices, even some diagnostic equipment had to go without heat, while the generator kept the most critical areas operational. Cars were becoming unreliable in the extreme cold. Batteries died overnight. Oil thickened to the consistency of molasses. Fuel lines froze. I had to keep my van running constantly, even when I was inside working, because if the engine got cold, it might not start again. The city's fleet of emergency vehicles was shrinking every day as more units broke down and couldn't be repaired. Public transportation had completely shut down. The buses couldn't handle the ice and snow, and the few that were still running kept breaking down. People who depended on public transit to get to work or medical appointments were stranded. The hospitals were seeing more and more people who had walked miles through snow and sub-zero temperatures to get medical care. That's when I started seeing the first signs that some people were giving up hope. I responded to a call at a senior living facility where the main boiler had failed, and when I got there, I found that half the residents had already been evacuated to other facilities. The staff said they couldn't keep the building warm enough to be safe, and they didn't have the resources to make major repairs. The remaining residents were mostly people who had nowhere else to go, and they were living in a building that was slowly becoming uninhabitable. I managed to get their heating system partially operational, but it was clear that it wouldn't last long. The building was old, poorly insulated, and the heating equipment was past the end of its useful life. I told the facility manager that they needed to plan for complete evacuation within a few weeks, because I couldn't keep coming back to fix a system that was fundamentally inadequate for the conditions we were facing. Similar conversations were happening all over the city. Apartment buildings were being abandoned as heating systems failed and couldn't be repaired. Small businesses were closing because they couldn't afford to heat their buildings. Even some government facilities were being consolidated or shut down as resources became too stretched to maintain them. The city was shrinking, concentrating people into the buildings that could still be kept warm. And I was becoming the person who decided which buildings those would be. October brought the moment when I realized this situation was permanent. Lake Huron started freezing. Not just ice formation along the shoreline, but actual freezing of open water. I'd lived in Michigan my entire life, and I'd never seen anything like it. The weather reports were calling it unprecedented ice formation and historically anomalous conditions. But what they really meant was that we were experiencing climate changes that hadn't happened in thousands of years. The government communications were becoming less frequent and less reassuring. Instead of promising that normal weather would return, officials were talking about adaptation strategies and long-term resilience planning. They were admitting, without actually saying it directly, that this was the new normal. The evacuation announcements started in mid-October. The state was recommending that people in northern Michigan relocate to warmer regions. They were offering transportation assistance and temporary housing for anyone who wanted to leave. But the logistics were nearly impossible. The roads were barely passable. The trains had stopped running weeks ago. And the southern states were dealing with their own climate emergencies as millions of people tried to migrate away from the cold. I got my first official request to join an evacuation convoy during the third week of October. Margaret Torres found me in the hospital boiler room and said there was a spot reserved for me on one of the medical transport vehicles heading south. Essential personnel were being given priority for evacuation, and my skills were needed in the emergency shelters that were being set up in warmer states. "Vincent, you've done everything you can here," she said, "but we're fighting a losing battle. The equipment is failing faster than you can fix it. The fuel supplies won't last through a real winter, and winter is coming whether we're ready or not." I looked around the boiler room at all the pipes and valves and gauges that kept the hospital running, at the jury-rigged repairs and improvised solutions that were holding everything together. I thought about the 300 patients upstairs who were alive, because I'd managed to keep the building warm for another day. "What happens to them if I leave?" I asked. "They get evacuated too, eventually. The ones who can travel, the ones who can't." She didn't finish the sentence, but we both knew what she meant. I told her I needed time to think about it, but I already knew what my answer would be. That night, I tried calling Lisa one more time. The phone lines to California had been down for weeks, but sometimes you could get through for a few minutes if you kept trying. The call actually connected, but the connection was so full of static that I could barely make out her voice. "Vincent," she said, "is that you?" "Lisa, I'm here. Are you okay? Are you safe?" The static got worse, but I think I heard her say something about Arizona, about driving south with her sister's family. Then the line went completely dead. I sat in my van in the hospital parking lot, surrounded by snow that was already 3 feet deep and still falling. The temperature was 15 below zero, and it was only October. Real winter was still 2 months away, and we were already living in conditions that would have been considered a natural disaster in the old world. That's when I understood that I had to make a choice. I could join the evacuation and try to find Lisa, try to build a new life somewhere warmer. Or I could stay and help the people who couldn't or wouldn't leave, the people who were depending on me to keep them alive for as long as possible. It wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning, I told Margaret Torres that I was staying. She looked at me for a long moment and nodded. I thought you might say that. We've identified a group of essential staff who are staying too. Doctors, nurses, security personnel. People who understand that someone has to keep the lights on, even if it's just for a little while longer. She handed me a list of buildings that were being designated as long-term shelters. Facilities with the best heating systems, the most reliable fuel supplies, the greatest chance of surviving an extended winter. Detroit General was on the list, along with 2 other hospitals, 3 schools, and 1 building that caught my attention, the Ford Rouge plant. It's got industrial heating capacity, Margaret explained. Steam boilers that were designed to heat a facility 10 times larger than what we'd need for a shelter. If we're going to concentrate people somewhere they can survive the winter, that might be our best option. I stared at the list and realized that this was how civilizations ended. Not with explosions or invasions, but with careful planning and resource allocation, and hard choices about who gets saved and who gets left behind. We were managing the decline, trying to make it as orderly and humane as possible. The first major power grid failure happened 2 days later. Half of Detroit lost electricity for 12 hours, and the temperature in most buildings dropped below freezing before emergency power could be restored. 3 people died of hypothermia in their own homes. 2 more died in apartment fires caused by people trying to heat their homes with candles and camping stoves. After that, the evacuation announcements became more urgent. The city was officially recommending that all non-essential personnel leave Detroit before November 1st. Transportation would be provided for anyone who wanted to go, but after that date, the city couldn't guarantee that evacuation would remain possible. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a temporary emergency anymore. This was about deciding who lives and who dies. That's when I understood this wasn't about fixing the heat anymore. This was about deciding who lives and who dies. November brought decisions I never thought I'd have to make. The evacuation convoys were leaving Detroit every few days, taking people south to emergency shelters in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But the logistics were becoming impossible. The highways were barely passable, fuel was scarce, and the vehicles that could handle the conditions were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Each convoy that left meant fewer resources for the people who stayed behind. I was getting calls from multiple facilities simultaneously, all of them desperate for my help. Detroit General needed their backup boiler rebuilt. St. Mary's Hospital had a heating system failure in their pediatric ward. The emergency shelter at Roosevelt Elementary had lost heat completely, and 200 people were at risk of freezing. The senior center on 8 Mile Road was running out of heating oil and needed me to convert their system to burn whatever fuel we could find. For the first time in my career, I had to make choices about which emergencies to respond to first. It came down to a brutal calculation. How many lives were at stake? How critical was the facility? How likely was I to actually solve the problem versus just delaying the inevitable? I developed a system for triaging these calls. Hospitals with ICU patients got top priority. Emergency shelters with children and elderly people came next. Everything else had to wait. It was the kind of resource allocation you read about in disaster management textbooks. But actually implementing it meant looking people in the eye and telling them I couldn't help them right now. The moral weight of these decisions was crushing. I remember getting a call from a family shelter where 30 people, including 8 children, had been without heat for 2 days. Their furnace had failed, and they were using space heaters that kept tripping the circuit breakers. The shelter coordinator was begging me to come immediately, saying the children were getting sick from the cold. But at the same time, Detroit General was calling about a critical failure in their main heating system. If I didn't get there within a few hours, they might have to start evacuating ICU patients, patients who would probably die during transport in sub-zero weather. I had to choose between saving 30 people who might survive a few more days without heat, or saving dozens of critical patients who would definitely die if the hospital got too cold. The math was clear, but the human cost was devastating. I went to the hospital first. It took me 6 hours to get their system running again. By the time I got to the family shelter, 2 of the children had been hospitalized with severe hypothermia, and the rest of the families had been evacuated to other facilities that were already overcrowded. That's when I realized I couldn't keep doing this alone. I started training other people to handle basic heating repairs. Hospital maintenance staff, school janitors, anyone with mechanical aptitude who was willing to learn. I showed them how to diagnose common problems, how to perform emergency repairs, how to jury-rig temporary solutions when proper parts weren't available. It wasn't ideal, but it meant I could focus on the most complex problems while other people handled routine maintenance. Dr. Sarah Chen from Detroit General became one of my most reliable partners during this period. She was an emergency room physician who had been working at the hospital for 8 years, and she understood better than most people how critical the heating systems were to patient survival. When I was working on complex repairs, she would assist me, holding flashlights, fetching tools, helping me navigate the maze of pipes and ducts that kept the hospital operational. Sarah was brilliant, methodical, and completely unflappable under pressure. She had steady hands and a logical mind that made her perfect for troubleshooting mechanical problems. More importantly, she understood the medical consequences of heating failures. She knew exactly which areas of the hospital were most critical, which patients were most vulnerable to temperature changes, and how long we had to fix problems before people started dying. "Vincent," she said one evening as we finished rebuilding a heat exchanger in the hospital basement, "I need to ask you something. How long can we realistically keep this going? How long before the equipment fails faster than we can repair it?" I looked around the boiler room, at all the jury-rigged repairs and improvised solutions that were holding the system together. "Sarah, we're already there. Every day we fix something, something else breaks. We're not really maintaining these systems anymore. We're just slowing down their inevitable failure." She nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. So what's our end game here? What happens when we can't fix it anymore?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, but I knew we had to face it. We need a more sustainable solution, a facility with newer equipment, better insulation, more reliable fuel supplies, somewhere we can concentrate people and resources instead of trying to keep dozens of failing buildings operational. That conversation led to the first serious discussions about establishing a permanent shelter at the Ford Rouge plant. Marcus Webb, the head of security at Detroit General, joined our planning sessions during the 3rd week of November. Marcus was a former Army sergeant who had been working hospital security for 5 years. He was a big guy, probably 6'4", and built like he could still handle military training. But he was also one of the smartest people I'd ever met when it came to logistics and resource management. Marcus had been quietly organizing the hospital's emergency supplies, coordinating with the remaining police and fire departments, and maintaining communications with other survivor groups around the city. He knew which buildings were still occupied, which facilities had useful resources, and which areas of the city had become too dangerous to enter. "The way I see it," Marcus said during one of our evening planning meetings, "we've got maybe 200 people left in this hospital, counting patients, staff, and family members who can't be evacuated. We've got supplies for maybe 6 weeks if we ration carefully, and we've got heating systems that are held together with prayer and determination." He spread out a map of Detroit on the conference table and pointed to several locations. "But we're not the only ones still here. There's a group at the community college that's got about 50 people, another 100 or so scattered between 3 different schools. Maybe 30 people holed up in the old GM plant on the east side. All of them are dealing with the same problems we are." Sarah leaned forward and studied the map. "So what are you suggesting?" "Consolidation," Marcus said. Instead of trying to keep 8 or 10 different facilities operational, we combine everyone into one location that has the best chance of surviving the winter, pool our resources, our expertise, our equipment. I knew where this was going, and I knew he was right. The Ford Rouge plant. Exactly. Industrial heating capacity designed for a facility 10 times larger than what we'd need. Steam boilers that can burn almost any combustible material, thick walls and good insulation, and enough space to house everyone comfortably instead of cramming them into overcrowded shelters. The idea made sense from an engineering perspective, but the logistics of moving everyone and establishing a new community were daunting. We'd need to transport people, medical equipment, food supplies, and everything else necessary for long-term survival. And we'd need to do it before the roads became completely impassable. But the alternative was watching people freeze to death in buildings that couldn't be saved. The decision to attempt the consolidation was made during the final week of November, when Detroit General's main boiler suffered a catastrophic failure that I couldn't repair. I was in the basement working on routine maintenance when I heard the explosion. Not a huge blast, but a sharp metallic bang followed by the sound of rushing steam. One of the main heat exchangers had cracked, and superheated water was spraying everywhere. I managed to shut down the system before anyone got seriously injured, but the damage was extensive. After 6 hours of assessment, I had to give Margaret tours and the hospital board the news they'd been dreading. The main boiler is done. Finished. I can't fix this with the parts and equipment we have available. The backup system might keep the most critical areas warm for a few more weeks, but it's not designed to heat the entire hospital. Margaret nodded calmly, but I could see the stress in her eyes. How long do we have? Days, not weeks, and that's only if the backup system doesn't fail too. That evening, Margaret called an emergency meeting of all remaining staff, patients who were able to participate, and family members. She explained the situation clearly and honestly. The hospital could no longer maintain safe temperatures throughout the building. They had 3 options. Attempt a dangerous evacuation in sub-zero weather to hospitals hundreds of miles away. Try to survive in a partially heated building that was becoming uninhabitable. Or join the consolidation effort at the Ford Rouge plant. The vote was unanimous. Everyone wanted to attempt the move to the Rouge plant. The next 3 days were a logistical nightmare that somehow became a miracle of cooperation and determination. We had to organize the transport of 200 people, including several dozen patients who required continuous medical care. We had to move essential medical equipment, food supplies, medications, and personal belongings. And we had to do it in temperatures that were approaching 30 below zero. Marcus organized the transportation using whatever vehicles were still operational. Hospital ambulances, a few city buses that could still handle the roads, pickup trucks with snow chains, and even a couple of military vehicles that the National Guard had abandoned when they pulled out of the city. Every trip was dangerous, and every vehicle that broke down meant stranded people in life-threatening conditions. I spent those 3 days working around the clock to get the Rouge plant's heating systems operational. The industrial boilers were in better condition than I'd expected, but they hadn't been maintained properly since the plant shut down. I had to rebuild control systems, replace corroded pipes, and jury-rig fuel delivery systems that could handle whatever combustible materials we could find. Sarah worked with the medical staff to set up a functional hospital in one section of the plant. They converted office spaces into patient rooms, established a pharmacy in a secure area, and created an operating room using portable equipment from Detroit General. It wasn't ideal, but it was functional. The most dangerous part of the move was transporting the ICU patients, people who were on life support, recovering from surgery, or too sick to survive interruption of their medical care. Sarah and I worked together to design a portable heating system that could keep the ambulances warm during transport, but it was still a terrifying risk. I remember the last trip, when we finally moved the most critical patients. I was riding in the lead ambulance, monitoring the heating system and making sure the temperature stayed stable. Sarah was in the back with two patients who were on ventilators, watching their vital signs and adjusting their care as we drove through snow-covered streets. "Vincent," she said quietly, "if this doesn't work, if we can't keep these people alive at the plant, it's not your fault. You've already saved more lives than anyone has a right to expect." I looked back at her, this brilliant doctor who had risked everything to help me keep people alive, and I realized that we'd become something more than colleagues. We'd become partners in a mission that neither of us had chosen, but both of us were committed to seeing through. "It's going to work," I told her. "It has to work." When we arrived at the Rouge plant, I saw something that gave me more hope than I'd felt in months. People were working together to unload vehicles, carry supplies, help patients get settled in their new accommodations. Former strangers were sharing blankets, organizing food distribution, and taking care of each other's children. In the middle of an apocalypse, we were building a community. But as December began and the temperature dropped even further, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning. We had 300 people depending on heating systems that were already showing signs of strain. We had limited fuel supplies and no reliable way to get more. And we had equipment that was older than some of the people we were trying to keep alive. The government radio broadcasts were becoming less frequent and less encouraging. Instead of promising rescue or assistance, they were broadcasting survival instructions and emergency protocols. The message was clear. We were on our own. December brought the first real test of our new community when the main fuel delivery truck broke down 3 miles from the plant. We were expecting a shipment of heating oil that was supposed to last us 2 weeks, but the truck slid off an icy road and couldn't be recovered. That fuel represented the difference between staying warm and watching people freeze. Marcus organized a salvage operation using every able-bodied person in the plant. We formed a human chain and hand-carried 50-gallon drums of heating oil through snow that was waist-deep in some places. It took 8 hours, and several people suffered frostbite, but we recovered enough fuel to keep the boilers running. That's when I realized that our survival wasn't just about my technical skills anymore. It was about the community we were building, the willingness of people to risk their own safety for the survival of the group. But it was also about the slow degradation of our resources and equipment, and the growing certainty that we were fighting a battle we couldn't win indefinitely. Christmas Eve was the coldest night we'd experienced yet, 45 below zero outside, and I could hear the boilers straining to keep the building warm. I was making my hourly rounds, checking gauges and adjusting controls, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A deep grinding noise from the main boiler, followed by a vibration that I could feel through the floor. The kind of mechanical stress that meant something was about to fail catastrophically. I spent Christmas morning in the boiler room, diagnosing a problem that I didn't have the parts to fix properly. The main bearings in the combustion air blower were wearing out, and if they failed completely, we'd lose the ability to maintain proper combustion in the boiler. Without proper combustion, the boiler would shut down automatically, and we'd lose heat for the entire facility. As I worked on a temporary repair using parts cannibalized from other equipment, I realized that this was our future, a series of increasingly desperate jury-rigged solutions, each one buying us a little more time, but bringing us closer to the moment when the equipment would fail completely, and there would be nothing left to fix. Sarah found me in the boiler room around noon on Christmas Day, covered in grease and exhaustion. "How bad is it?" she asked. I looked at the gauges, at the temporary repairs that were already showing signs of stress, at the fuel levels that were dropping faster than they should be. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand what it means. This repair might last a week, maybe 2 if we're lucky, but the next failure might be something I can't fix." She nodded slowly. "What do we do then?" "We hope it doesn't happen, and we start planning for what comes after." As we counted down to 2025, I wasn't celebrating a new year. I was counting down to when our luck would run out. As we counted down to 2025, I wasn't celebrating a new year. I was counting down to when our luck would run out. January brought system failures that cascaded faster than I could repair them. The temporary fix I'd made to the main boiler on Christmas morning lasted exactly 9 days. On January 2nd, the combustion air blower failed completely, and the automatic safety systems shut down the entire boiler to prevent a catastrophic explosion. Within 2 hours, the temperature in the Rouge plant started dropping toward dangerous levels. I had 300 people depending on me to solve a problem that couldn't be solved with conventional repairs. The replacement parts I needed simply didn't exist anymore. The industrial supply companies were closed. The manufacturers were shut down. Even if I could find the parts somewhere, there was no way to transport them through the snow-covered wasteland that Detroit had become. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I improvised. I cannibalized the blower motor from one of the smaller backup boilers and jury-rigged it to work with the main system. It wasn't designed for that application, and it was probably running at twice its rated capacity, but it worked. Sort of. The main boiler was operating at about 70% efficiency, which meant we were burning fuel faster than we should have been, and the whole system was under constant stress. But we had heat. For now. The problem was that every jury-rigged repair created new problems elsewhere. When I took the blower motor from the backup boiler, that system became inoperable. When I rerouted steam lines to compensate for failing heat exchangers, other parts of the building started losing heat. I was playing a chess game where every move sacrificed something important to protect something even more critical. Sarah and I developed a system for managing these cascading failures. We identified the most essential areas of the plant that absolutely had to stay warm. The medical facility where we were treating patients. The common areas where people slept and ate. The kitchen where we prepared meals. Everything else became optional. Office spaces, storage areas, even some of the workshops that we'd been using for repairs. We were systematically abandoning parts of our own shelter as the heating systems failed. The fuel situation was becoming desperate too. Our rationing calculations had been based on normal boiler efficiency, but the jury-rigged systems were consuming heating oil at nearly double the expected rate. What should have been a 2-week supply was lasting 8 or 9 days. Marcus was organizing increasingly dangerous scavenging missions to find fuel in abandoned buildings around Detroit, but those sources were running out too. I remember one morning in mid-January when I woke up to find frost forming on the inside of the windows in the main common area. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing in the spaces where people were sleeping. Children were waking up with chattering teeth, and the elderly residents were showing signs of hypothermia even under multiple layers of blankets. That's when I realized we were losing the battle against entropy and time. I called an emergency meeting with Sarah, Marcus, and the other community leaders. We gathered in the boiler room because it was the warmest place in the building, and I laid out the situation as clearly as I could. The heating systems are failing faster than I can repair them, I told them. Every fix is temporary, and each failure is worse than the last one. We're burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and our equipment inventory is nearly exhausted. At the current rate of degradation, we have maybe 3 weeks before we lose the ability to keep this building warm enough for human survival. Marcus leaned back against a steam pipe and shook his head. So what are our options? We can try to consolidate everyone into an even smaller space, pick the most defensible area of the building and abandon everything else. That might buy us another few weeks, but it's not a long-term solution. Sarah looked around the boiler room, at all the gauges and pipes and jury-rigged repairs that were holding our world together. What about moving again? Finding another facility with better heating systems? Where? I asked. Every building in Detroit is dealing with the same problems. Equipment failures, fuel shortages, systems that weren't designed for these conditions. We'd be trading our current problems for identical problems in a different location. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. We all understood what I wasn't saying directly. We were probably going to watch people freeze to death, and there might not be anything we could do to prevent it. But Marcus had been thinking about contingency plans that went beyond just heating systems. Vincent, what if we could reduce the heating load? What if we could make the space we're trying to heat smaller and more efficient? I looked at him, not understanding where he was going with this. Interior walls, he said. Temporary insulation. We could build an insulated shelter inside the plant, something much smaller and easier to heat. Concentrate everyone into a space that's designed for survival instead of trying to heat an entire industrial building. It was actually a brilliant idea. Instead of heating thousands of square feet of space, we could create a smaller, heavily insulated area that would require a fraction of the energy to keep warm. It would mean giving up most of our living space, but it might be the difference between life and death. The next week was spent in frantic construction activity. Every able-bodied person in the community was involved in building what we started calling the core. We used materials salvaged from abandoned buildings around Detroit, insulation pulled from the walls of empty houses, lumber from demolished structures, sheets of plastic and metal that could serve as vapor barriers and wind breaks. I had to completely redesign the heating distribution system to serve the much smaller space. Instead of trying to heat the entire plant, I focused all of our heating capacity on an area about the size of a large house. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and claustrophobic, but it was warm. The construction work was exhausting and dangerous. People were working in sub-zero temperatures, handling materials with bare hands because gloves made it impossible to do detailed work. Several people suffered frostbite. One man fell from a ladder and broke his arm, adding to Sarah's patient load. But somehow we got it done. When we moved everyone into the core, the difference was immediate and dramatic. The heating systems that had been struggling to keep the entire plant barely warm were now able to maintain comfortable temperatures in our smaller space. Our fuel consumption dropped by more than half. For the first time in weeks, children were able to play without wearing heavy coats indoors. But the victory was temporary and incomplete. We still had the same fundamental problems. Equipment that was failing faster than I could repair it, fuel supplies that were dwindling toward zero, and weather conditions that were still getting worse. The radio reports were becoming increasingly grim. The few government broadcasts that were still operating were reporting that the volcanic ash was showing no signs of dissipating. Global temperatures were continuing to drop. Agricultural production had essentially stopped in most regions. The federal government was struggling to maintain basic services even in the southern states where conditions were more survivable. There were also reports of other survivor communities scattered throughout the Midwest and Northeast. Some were thriving, like ours. Others had failed completely, with entire groups of people freezing to death when their heating systems collapsed. It was becoming clear that survival was largely a matter of luck, resources, and the technical expertise to keep critical systems operational. That expertise was taking a toll on me that I was trying to hide from everyone else. I was working 18 to 20-hour days, constantly monitoring systems that could fail catastrophically without warning. I was making life or death decisions multiple times per day. The stress was causing my hands to shake, and I was having trouble sleeping even when I was exhausted. Sarah noticed the changes in me during the last week of January. She found me in the boiler room at 3 in the morning, checking gauges that I'd already checked an hour earlier. "Vincent, when was the last time you slept for more than 2 hours at a time?" she asked. I couldn't remember. "Sarah, if I'm not monitoring these systems constantly, people die. If a heat exchanger fails overnight and the safety systems don't respond properly, we could lose heat for the entire core. 300 people could freeze to death while I'm sleeping." She sat down next to me on a crate of spare parts, And if you collapse from exhaustion, 300 people die anyway. You're not superhuman. You can't keep this up indefinitely." She was right, but I didn't see any alternative. I was the only person in the community who really understood the heating systems. I'd trained others to handle basic maintenance, but the complex diagnostic work and major repairs required knowledge and experience that couldn't be transferred quickly. "I need to teach you," I told her. "Not just basic maintenance, but real troubleshooting. How to diagnose problems, how to jury-rig solutions when proper repairs aren't possible. If something happens to me, someone else has to be able to keep these systems running." Over the next few days, Sarah became my apprentice in a crash course on industrial heating systems. She was a quick learner, methodical and careful, with the steady hands of a surgeon and the logical mind of someone trained in emergency medicine. But learning to repair complex mechanical systems takes years, not days, and we both knew that her knowledge would be limited if she had to take over. The crisis that tested everything we'd built came during the first week of February, when the main steam distribution manifold developed a catastrophic crack. I was doing routine maintenance when I heard the distinctive hiss of steam escaping under high pressure. The crack was in a main distribution pipe that carried steam from the boilers to the heating coils throughout the core. It was the kind of failure that could shut down our entire heating system, and it was happening in a location that was almost impossible to access for repairs. The crack was behind a wall that we'd built during the core construction, in a space that was barely large enough for one person to crawl through. The steam escaping from the crack was at nearly 200 degrees, hot enough to cause severe burns on contact, and the pipe was under constant pressure, which meant that any attempt to repair it would be extremely dangerous. But if I didn't fix it, we'd lose heat throughout the core within hours. I spent 2 hours developing a repair plan that had maybe a 50% chance of success and a significant probability of killing me in the process. I would have to shut down the entire heating system, drain the steam lines, crawl into the confined space behind the wall, and make repairs in a location where I could barely move my arms. Sarah volunteered to assist with the repair, which meant crawling into the same dangerous space and helping me work in conditions that would have challenged experienced industrial technicians with proper equipment. Marcus organized the rest of the community to prepare for the loss of heat, distributing every available blanket and moving people into the smallest possible spaces to conserve body heat. The repair took 6 hours. 6 hours of working in cramped, freezing conditions, making precision cuts and welds on pipes that were barely accessible. 6 hours of knowing that if we made a mistake, the entire heating system could fail catastrophically. 6 hours of holding the lives of 300 people in our hands. When we finally got the system back online and heat started flowing through the core again, people actually cheered. But I knew that this was just another temporary victory in a war we were slowly losing. That night, Sarah and I sat in the boiler room, exhausted and covered in grease and pipe sealant. The repair had worked, but we both knew that it was a patch on a jury-rigged system that was held together by determination and luck. "How many more times can we do this?" Sarah asked. I looked at the gauges, at the vibration in the steam lines, at the stress indicators that showed systems operating far beyond their design limits. "I don't know, but Sarah, I need you to understand something. The next major failure might be something we can't fix, something that ends everything we've built here." She nodded slowly. "So what do? We hope it doesn't happen, and we start planning for what comes after." The weather reports that week showed temperatures dropping to 50 below zero, the coldest conditions any of us had experienced. The radio was broadcasting survival instructions that basically amounted to finding shelter and staying warm until spring, which might or might not come. The government had essentially admitted that they couldn't provide assistance to isolated survivor communities. We were truly on our own. As February continued, I started hearing unusual noises from the main boiler system. Subtle changes in the vibration patterns, occasional fluctuations in steam pressure, minor variations in combustion efficiency. To most people, these would have been unnoticeable. But I'd been living with these systems for months, monitoring every gauge and listening to every sound. I knew that something was wrong. The main boiler was showing signs of serious structural stress, metal fatigue from constant thermal cycling, pressure vessel distortion from operating at extreme conditions, control system degradation from jury-rigged repairs and improvised modifications. It was the kind of progressive failure that might take weeks to develop or might happen catastrophically without warning. I started doing more frequent inspections, checking components that I'd never worried about before, looking for stress cracks in pressure vessels, testing safety systems that hadn't been exercised in months, preparing contingency plans for failures that might leave us without heat for extended periods. But I didn't tell anyone else about my concerns. The community was already under enormous stress, and there was nothing they could do about boiler problems anyway. Sarah and Marcus knew that our situation was precarious, but they didn't understand the technical details of how precarious it really was. The end of February brought a discovery that changed everything. While scavenging for spare parts in an abandoned section of the plant, Marcus found something that could solve our long-term heating problems, or kill us all trying to implement it. He found the original engineering blueprints for the Rouge plant's heating system, including specifications for a more efficient boiler configuration that had never been implemented. According to the plans, it was possible to reconfigure our existing boilers to operate at much higher efficiency, using less fuel and providing more reliable heat distribution. The catch was that implementing the reconfiguration would require shutting down our heating systems for at least 12 hours, probably longer. 12 hours without heat in 50 below zero weather would be fatal for many of our most vulnerable residents. But if the reconfiguration worked, it could solve our fuel shortage problems and provide reliable heating for months instead of weeks. It was the kind of decision that defined the difference between survival and extinction. Take a calculated risk that might save everyone, or continue with the status quo that was slowly but inevitably leading to failure. As I studied the blueprints and calculated the probability of success, I realized that this might be our last real chance to build something sustainable. If we could make the reconfiguration work, we might survive until spring. If we couldn't, or if we didn't try at all, we were probably going to freeze to death anyway. The temperature outside hit -40 degrees that night, the coldest yet recorded. I could hear the building contracting from the extreme cold, metal and concrete groaning under thermal stress. The heating systems were running at maximum capacity just to maintain barely survivable temperatures in the core. That's when the main boiler started making a sound I'd never heard before. A deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the pressure vessel itself. The kind of sound that meant structural failure was imminent. I had 12 hours to completely rebuild our heating system, or 300 people would freeze to death. And I had to do it in the dark, in sub-zero temperatures, with parts that were never meant to work together. I had 12 hours to completely rebuild our heating system, or 300 people would freeze to death. And I had to do it in the dark, in sub-zero temperatures, with parts that were never meant to work together. The deep vibration from the main boiler was getting worse by the hour. Every time the system cycled on, the entire pressure vessel would shake in a way that made my stomach drop. I'd seen boiler failures before, and this was exactly how they started. Metal fatigue progressing to structural failure, pressure vessels developing stress fractures that could lead to catastrophic rupture. If the main boiler failed completely, we'd lose 70% of our heating capacity instantly. The backup systems couldn't handle the load of keeping the entire core warm in -40-degree weather. People would start showing signs of hypothermia within hours, and the most vulnerable residents would start dying within a day. But the reconfiguration blueprints that Marcus had found offered a solution that was both brilliant and terrifying. If I could successfully implement the new boiler arrangement, we'd have more reliable heating capacity, and dramatically better fuel efficiency. The problem was that the reconfiguration required completely shutting down our heating systems during the most dangerous weather conditions we'd experienced yet. I gathered Sarah, Marcus, and the other community leaders in the boiler room at 6 o'clock that evening. The temperature outside was still dropping, and the weather radio was predicting it would hit 55 below zero before morning. Inside the core, we were maintaining about 68 degrees, but that was with all systems running at maximum capacity. I need to explain what's happening and what our options are, I told them. The main boiler is developing structural problems that could cause it to fail catastrophically at any time. If that happens, we lose most of our heating capacity, and people start dying within hours. Sarah looked at the gauges and indicators around the boiler room. She'd learned enough over the past month to understand what she was seeing, and I could see the concern in her eyes. How long do we have before it fails? Hours, maybe days. There's no way to predict exactly when metal fatigue leads to structural failure, but every hour we continue operating increases the risk of catastrophic breakdown. Marcus studied the blueprints spread out on the workbench, and this reconfiguration can solve the problem. If it works, yes. The new arrangement would distribute the thermal load more evenly, reduce stress on individual components, and increase overall system efficiency by about 30%. It could solve our fuel shortage problems and give us reliable heating through whatever's left of this winter. And if it doesn't work, that was the question I'd been dreading. If the reconfiguration fails, or if I can't get it completed before people start freezing, we lose everything. Everyone in the core would be exposed to lethal temperatures for an extended period. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an impossible decision. Continue operating systems that were about to fail catastrophically, or attempt a repair that might kill everyone if it went wrong. Dr. Chen from our medical facility had joined the meeting, and she spoke up with the kind of clinical clarity that made her invaluable in crisis situations. Vincent, from a medical perspective, how long can people survive in an unheated building in these conditions? I'd been running those calculations in my head for hours. Children and elderly residents would start showing signs of severe hypothermia within 4 to 6 hours. Healthy adults might last 8 to 10 hours before becoming incapacitated. After 12 hours, we'd start losing people. And how long would the reconfiguration take? Best case scenario, 10 hours if everything goes perfectly. Realistic estimate, 12 to 14 hours. Worst case, 18 hours or more if we run into unexpected problems. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. So we're talking about a procedure that will almost certainly result in some casualties, versus waiting for a boiler failure that will definitely result in mass casualties. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had become leaders of a community none of us had chosen to create. Are there any other options? I'd been asking myself that question for days. We could attempt a partial evacuation, move the most vulnerable residents to other survivor communities that might have better heating systems. But the transportation risks in these conditions are enormous, and we don't even know if those other communities still exist or would be able to accept refugees. Sarah shook her head. We've come too far together to start abandoning people now. If we're going to take this risk, we take it as a community. The vote was unanimous, but it was the kind of unanimous decision that comes from having no real alternatives. We would attempt the reconfiguration starting at midnight, hoping to complete the work before the cold killed the people we were trying to save. The next 6 hours were spent in frantic preparation. We moved everyone in the core into the smallest possible spaces, concentrating body heat and distributing every blanket, sleeping bag, and warm clothing item we could find. We set up emergency heating stations using small camp stoves and portable heaters, knowing they could only provide minimal warmth for short periods. We organized volunteer teams to monitor the most vulnerable residents and watch for signs of hypothermia. Marcus coordinated the logistics with military precision, teams of people to assist with the technical work, rotating schedules to ensure continuous monitoring of community members, emergency protocols for medical situations that might arise during the heating outage, communication systems to coordinate between different areas of the Corps. Sarah worked with the medical staff to prepare for the casualties we knew were coming. They set up warming stations with heated IV fluids and warming blankets. They identified residents who were most at risk and assigned medical personnel to monitor them closely. They prepared medications and equipment for treating severe hypothermia. At 11:30 that night, I made my final checks of the equipment and materials I'd need for the reconfiguration. Tools that could function in sub-zero temperatures, welding equipment that could operate without electrical power from the main systems, spare parts that I'd cannibalized from other equipment around the plant. Everything I'd learned about heating systems over 15 years of working in the trade. At midnight, I shut down the heating systems that had kept 300 people alive for the past 2 months. The temperature in the core started dropping immediately. Within 30 minutes, you could see your breath in the air. Within an hour, frost was forming on the windows and metal surfaces. Within 2 hours, people were huddling together under multiple layers of blankets, sharing body heat to stay warm. The technical work was the most challenging repair I'd ever attempted. I had to completely reconfigure the steam distribution manifold, reroute primary heating lines, and rebuild the combustion air systems. Much of the work had to be done in cramped spaces with limited lighting, using tools that became increasingly difficult to handle as my hands got cold. Sarah assisted with every step of the process, holding flashlights, fetching tools, and helping with precision work that required 2 people. Her medical training made her invaluable for the detailed, methodical work that complex repairs demand. But more importantly, her presence kept me focused and calm during the most stressful repair job of my life. By hour 4, the temperature in the core had dropped to 35 degrees. People were showing the early signs of cold stress. Shivering, difficulty with fine motor control, confusion and irritability. The medical team was moving constantly through the community, checking on vulnerable residents and providing what warming assistance they could. By hour 6, we had our first casualty, an elderly man named Frank who had been struggling with respiratory problems for weeks. The cold stress was too much for his compromised system, and he went into cardiac arrest. Dr. Chen and her team managed to resuscitate him, but it was clear that time was running out for the most vulnerable residents. I was making progress on the reconfiguration, but it was taking longer than I'd hoped. The existing systems were more corroded and damaged than the blueprints had indicated. Connections that should have been simple were requiring complete rebuilds. Components that should have been functional were failing under the stress of modification. By hour 8, the temperature had dropped to 25 degrees, and people were moving beyond cold stress into the early stages of hypothermia. Children were becoming lethargic and confused. Elderly residents were showing signs of cardiac stress. The medical team was working frantically to provide warming care with extremely limited resources. That's when Marcus made a decision that probably saved lives. He organized the community into body heat sharing groups, with healthy adults surrounding children and elderly residents to provide warming. People who had been strangers 6 months ago were now literally keeping each other alive with shared body heat. I was working as fast as I could, but precision was critical. One mistake in the pressure vessel connections could result in a catastrophic failure that would leave us without any heating capacity at all. Every joint had to be perfect. Every weld had to be structurally sound. Every connection had to be tested and verified. Sarah was monitoring my condition as much as the repair work. She could see that the cold was affecting my manual dexterity and cognitive function. My hands were shaking from cold and stress, making precision work increasingly difficult. But stopping wasn't an option. Too many lives depended on getting the systems operational again. By hour 10, I was in the final stages of the reconfiguration. The new steam distribution system was connected and pressure tested. The modified combustion air systems were ready for startup. The control systems had been recalibrated for the new configuration. But I still had to complete the startup sequence and verify that everything worked before people started dying from hypothermia. The temperature in the core had dropped to 18 degrees. People were beyond the shivering stage and moving into severe hypothermia. Several residents had become unconscious, and the medical team was struggling to maintain their core body temperatures with heated blankets and warm IV fluids. The startup sequence was the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life. If the reconfigured systems didn't work, or if there were problems that prevented immediate heat production, we'd have no backup options. The original boiler configuration had been dismantled during the modification process. If the new arrangement failed, everyone in the core would freeze to death within hours. I initiated the startup sequence at 10:45 a.m., nearly 11 hours after shutting down the heating systems. The combustion systems ignited properly. The steam pressure began building in the new distribution manifold. The circulation pumps came online and began moving heated water through the system. And then, slowly, beautifully, heat started flowing back into the core. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Within 30 minutes, the temperature had climbed back above freezing. Within an hour, people were able to remove some of their emergency layers. Within 2 hours, the core was back to comfortable temperatures, and the modified systems were operating more efficiently than our original configuration had ever managed. The reconfiguration was a complete success. Our fuel consumption dropped by nearly 40%. The heating distribution was more even and reliable. The stress on individual system components was reduced dramatically. For the first time since the crisis began, we had heating systems that might actually be sustainable for months instead of weeks. But the human cost of the repair had been significant. We'd lost 2 elderly residents during the heating outage, people whose systems couldn't handle the extreme cold stress. Several others had suffered frostbite and required ongoing medical care. Everyone in the community had been pushed to the limits of human endurance. As I sat in the boiler room that evening, monitoring the new systems and listening to the steady, reliable operation of equipment that was finally working as it should, I realized that we'd achieved something remarkable. We'd taken a desperate situation and engineered a solution that gave us a real chance of survival. Sarah found me there around midnight checking gauges that were finally showing stable, sustainable operation. "Vincent, you did it. You actually did it." I looked around the boiler room at all the modified systems and reconfigured equipment that represented months of jury-rigged repairs and improvised solutions. We did it, all of us. This community did something that should have been impossible. Over the next few weeks, the improved efficiency of our heating systems allowed us to extend our fuel supplies significantly. The reliability of the new configuration meant I could finally get more than a few hours of sleep at a time. The community began to develop routines and social structures that looked less like survival and more like actual living. We started receiving radio signals from other survivor communities, confirming that we weren't alone in our struggle. Some groups had failed completely, but others were thriving in various locations across the Midwest and Northeast. There was even talk of establishing communication networks and mutual aid agreements between surviving communities. Marcus organized scouting expeditions to explore other parts of Detroit, looking for useful resources and checking on any other survivor groups that might still be in the area. They found evidence of other communities that had tried and failed, but they also discovered supplies and equipment that could be useful for our continued survival. Sarah expanded our medical capabilities by training more community members in basic health care and establishing protocols for managing the chronic health problems that were developing from months of survival living. The psychological stress of the apocalypse was affecting everyone, but we were learning to cope with it as a community. As March arrived and the radio weather reports began mentioning the possibility of slightly warmer temperatures, I allowed myself to think about something beyond just surviving the next day. The volcanic ash was still blocking most sunlight, and normal seasonal warming wasn't going to happen anytime soon. But we'd proven that we could maintain a viable community even in impossible conditions. The Rouge plant had become more than just a shelter. It was home to a group of people who had learned to depend on each other for survival. We'd created something that worked, something sustainable, something that gave us hope for whatever came next. I still thought about Lisa every day, wondering if she'd made it to safety somewhere warmer, wondering if I'd ever see her again. But I'd also come to understand that the life I'd lived before Yellowstone exploded was gone forever. The world had changed fundamentally, and so had I 6 months ago. I was Vincent Kowalski, an HVAC technician who fixed air conditioners and worried about ordinary problems. Now I was the person responsible for keeping 300 people alive in conditions that had killed most of civilization. I'd learned skills I never knew I needed, made decisions I never thought I'd have to make, and discovered that I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. The heating systems were running smoothly now, fuel supplies were stable, and the community was thriving as much as anyone could thrive in an ice age. We'd built something that could last, something that gave people hope and safety, and the chance to imagine a future beyond just surviving. But I also knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer story. The volcanic ash wasn't going away anytime soon. The climate changes we were experiencing might last for years or decades. The old world of easy heating oil deliveries and reliable supply chains was gone permanently. We'd have to keep adapting, keep innovating, keep finding ways to live in a world that was fundamentally different from the one we'd been born into. There would be new challenges, new crises, new problems that would require solutions we hadn't thought of yet. And there would be other communities like ours, scattered across the frozen continent, struggling to build something viable from the ruins of civilization. Maybe someday we'd find ways to connect with them, to share resources and knowledge and hope. As I sit here now in the Rouge plant, listening to the steady operation of heating systems that finally work the way they should, surrounded by people who have become family in the most unexpected circumstances, I understand that we've accomplished something extraordinary. We've survived 6 months of conditions that killed most of the world. We've built a community that works. We've proven that human ingenuity and cooperation can overcome almost anything. The ice age isn't over. The ash clouds haven't cleared. The world outside is still a frozen wasteland where temperatures that should never happen in inhabited places have become normal. But we're still here, still warm, still alive, still human. And that's enough.